Great to have you with us today. We are live our second day in Doha, Qatar, for our annual trip to the Middle East, trying to make sense of some of the things that are going on here. We are at one of the most fascinating collegiate opportunities that I've ever seen in my life. We are at Georgetown University in Qatar, which is part of the education city in Qatar, where there are a number of major colleges participating in one of the most unique education programs that I've ever seen. And we're with Dr. Gerd Nonneman, and he is a professor of international relations and Gulf Studies at Georgetown, which is part of the Educational Center in Qatar. And he is an expert on Middle East politics, specialized specifically here in the Gulf, on the Gulf economy and Gulf politics. And I've never seen anything like this in my life. There are, it looks like 8 or 9 colleges, universities participating in this. We're going to get into all of that, but a fascinating situation. Dr. Nonneman, good to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure.
You know, we were talking earlier, Doctor, and you were talking about the original vision of educational city here in Qatar, the number of colleges that got involved, and you said it was the original idea of the father Emir and his wife, the princess. How did this all come to be?
Well, as you say, it was very much their idea as part of the, I think, the overall development vision for this country, which has really come a long way very fast. And one of the things they wanted to do, obviously, was develop what they call a knowledge economy. It's always problematic to define exactly what that is, but at least you need a high-quality education. You need to build the skill sets. And their view was that the best way to stimulate that level of education was to bring top universities from around the world, and not just bring a wholesale university and let them do everything, but pick particular subjects that were seen as very important in building this economy and this knowledge economy, and then define which universities were leading the world in those fields and try to persuade them to come. And they succeeded.
To come to Qatar, to come to the Gulf.
Exactly right. And
not the easiest thing to do.
Some of these universities had no tradition of that kind of foreign.
And Georgetown being one of them.
Georgetown had no tradition of having brick and mortar operations outside the US, but they always saw themselves as an international university. With this whole old Jesuit mission of educating the world on the margins, right, and so on. So it kind of made sense, but all these universities, including Georgetown, of course, had questions about brand. You want to make sure your brand isn't affected, and so they needed a lot of reassurance. And Sheikh Moza, the father Amir's wife, who was really the force driving this whole project, clearly wowed them and persuaded them, not least by ensuring there was going to be academic freedom, and that's one of the key ingredients, right? And there was not going to be any interference in what students get selected, who gets appointed, who is promoted.
So no interference by the Qatari government? Zero,
because it's not the Qatar Foundation through which this is funded is actually kind of at one arm's length from the government. The money comes from Qatari gas reserves or gas revenues, but ultimately there's a firewall between the agreement to fund these operations and what actually happens in the educational and academic field.
How did they come up with the original name of the consortium of education?
Well, I suppose Education City kind of makes sense, right? I mean, it's big. As you move through it, it's still growing. It's not just universities. There's a number of other things that you find here. Well, first of all, you find more recently a locally grown university called HBKU, or Hamad bin Khalifa University. They're trying to build an indigenous elite university with some collaboration of these existing branch campuses. But there's also research institutes. There's a kind of we call it a place for startups to link up with scientific research, and so on. So there's some equivalent of a national research lab as well, which they're trying to develop. There's all those kind of things happening, all in Education City.
Right. We're live today with Dr. Gerd, I want to say your first name right, Dr. Gerd Nonneman.
That's close enough.
Okay, that's good enough. Dr. Gerd Nonneman, Professor of International Relations and Gulf Studies at Georgetown University, live in Doha, Qatar, and we're in Education City, where there are a number of universities participating here. It's all in one big campus, but separated, and it includes, and Dr. Nonneman, correct me if I leave anybody out, but they include your own Georgetown, Texas A&M, Cornell, Carnegie Mellon from Pittsburgh, our own Virginia Commonwealth out of Richmond, the Parisian School for Master's Degree for Executive HEC Paris, the University College of London is here, and then of course Northwestern, which has a huge journalism school, and then you mentioned HBKU, which is the Qatari school that's coming in process. I mean, that is, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 universities here. That's
Correct.
an incredible number.
It's, it's not so much what precise number is. What I find exciting about this, and what's quite innovative about this project is you bring those universities together. You bring particular fields together. Not whole universities, but sections in which they excel internationally. You put them all together, and you hope for some synergies. That's still evolving, but already one of the things that you can do here as a Georgetown student or a Northwestern student that you can't do in the home campus so much is you can cross-register in all these other universities. And we encourage that. So the students socialize together, they have experiences together. There's huge numbers of nationalities, even just Georgetown. We've got about 40-odd nationalities in the classroom. And we even started up a joint minor, or as we call it, the Georgetown certificate, with Northwestern, media and politics, which didn't exist in DC, right? So we can do this here because the opportunity is here. It's very exciting.
It's a joint venture then between the two universities, Northwestern and Georgetown, where you could do a minor. But the power of this is, as an undergraduate student, I could be attending Georgetown, but then I could take something at Virginia Commonwealth or something at Carnegie Mellon if I was interested in that, and I get the same credit for that.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, you were also mentioning to me, Dr. Nonneman, that the admission process is the exact same in your campus here at Education City in Doha as it is in Washington, D.C. Everything is the same.
The process isn't exactly the same because, of course, we're localized. We got to run that from here. And you get a different kind of public applying here, perhaps than would apply in D.C. But the standards have got to be the same because the curriculum is the same, and the brand has got to be safeguarded.
Right.
So if the curriculums, and plus our students are also encouraged to go and spend a semester in DC, for instance. And we get people students from DC coming to spend a semester here. Right. So it's got to be equivalent in quality, and it's a demanding curriculum. So you're not going to accept anybody who is likely to fail. So that really puts a floor under who can get in. So it's a tough entrance process. But our best students are absolutely on a par with the best students in DC. In fact, one year, that's always a source of pride. One year, the valedictorian of the whole class, the School of Foreign Service, was one of ours. And she was then invited to go and give the commencement address in DC.
In DC. That's a very significant achievement, no doubt. And getting a undergraduate degree in Georgetown here in Doha, Qatar, the same as if you were in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, we don't issue separate
and the same with Texas A&M or the same with Northwestern.
I mean, I don't know the detail about how the other universities run it, but that's the general principle. Right? So there's no separate degree issued here. This is a degree signed by the dean of the School of Foreign Service and by the provost or the president, and that's it. And they're even considered part of the same cohort. Doesn't matter where you're located.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So going forward, and you said that you've been in the Gulf for 2 decades. You've been in Qatar for 2 decades, and in your 7th year at Georgetown.
Right. So I've been living here for 7 years, initially as dean of the school here, and then after my first 5-year term, it's a 24/7 job. So I have to continue as a professor here. I could have opted to do that in DC, but I find this place so interesting. If you're interested in Gulf politics, where better to be here than here. So.
No question about Gulf politics, and we're going to get into that in a minute. What is the vision now going forward? What is the longer-term plan, Dr. Nonneman?
So all the universities here are here under 10-year agreements with Qatar Foundation, and there are different stages. So we finished our first 10 years 2 years ago. We negotiated a new 10-year agreement. So we're now in, I suppose, nearing we're halfway through the second year of the second 10 years. Beyond that, I mean, it depends on Qatar Foundation on the one hand and Georgetown on the other. But I think that we're here for the long term. In fact, when our president, Jack DeJoya, came to visit when the new contract was signed, he went to see the emir, and he regularly meets the emir, and was expressed his happiness over the next 10 years, and apparently was told, no, this is a like a Catholic marriage. This is for good, right, for a duration. So, So I think the people are here, including the faculty, the professors. We've now got a group of people. While there is circulation from DC, we also want people to really come and invest their careers here. And they don't do that if they think it's a short-term project.
Exactly. You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We are live in Doha, Qatar. We're in Education City, and we're with Dr. Gerd Nonneman. He is a professor of international relations and Gulf studies, and he's also an expert on Middle East politics and specializing in Gulf politics and the Gulf economy. That brings us, Dr. Nonneman, to Gulf politics, which is your specialty. So we have to be able to talk about this a little bit.
Absolutely.
The timing of our visit couldn't be better. So we have the siege, as they call it, I've learned in Doha, Qatar. We have the siege, which is basically the embargo of the other 4 Gulf states plus Egypt, which, so that everyone knows, includes the UAE, United Arab Emirates, the Saudis, Bahrain, and Egypt, which has placed an embargo on the state of Qatar of goods and services and the free movement of people. Now, the Qatari government has figured out economically how to get around some of it. It took them some time, but they've been able to do that. But it's got humanitarian implications and is causing tremendous strife within the GCC, which is now divided, if you will. Allegations have been made. The emir and the Qatari government has denied it. Just to give the quick background, and then we'll turn it over to you. Basically, the 4 embargoing countries, and jump in if I get anything wrong, basically just outline for our audience, have accused the Qatari government of being too cozy with Tehran, of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood behind the scenes, of funding terrorism behind the scenes, and not being upfront with it. And also, they accuse the Al Jazeera International news network of being a propaganda machine that ferments terrorist activity. Those are the 4 basic things, all of which the Qatari government has unequivocally denied. And then the embargoing states have laid out 13 conditions. Several of them, the current emir, Al Thani, has said that they would never do that, which is shutting down Al Jazeera and extraditing Qatari citizens or people that are in Qatar legally, and there's a couple others. And then last evening, the president, who is meeting with the Saudi prince today in D.C. or this week, said that, well, he's given the GCC enough time to figure this out on their own. He was hoping they would. But now President Trump says perhaps the U.S. has to intervene in the mediation because the Kuwaiti effort failed. Have I kind of summed it up?
Pretty much.
Fill in the detail.
So there's the GCC is six countries. There's 6 monarchical countries of the Gulf, all pro-Western, all with a very strong security link with the United States and other Western countries, and all in some ways similar in organization and political structures. But they, as you say, they're split down the middle. It's not as if all the rest of the Gulf countries are ganging up on Qatar. It's Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE. It's certainly not Oman or Kuwait. So effectively, the GCC has now become irrelevant to a large extent. The GCC actually has a notional dispute settlement mechanism, which is supposed to kick in when there are real serious questions internally. It was never even referred to. The GCC Secretary General was completely missing in action during this whole thing. There is also the Council of Rulers, the Supreme Council of Rulers of the 6 countries, which are supposed to discuss these issues. They never got into the picture. So Qatar did find itself suddenly, they woke up and they discovered that the Emir had supposedly said things, as per Qatar news agency, that didn't match Qatari policy at all. And of course, the place where he's supposed to have said it, he had no speaking role. And the people who were there knew that he hadn't spoken at all. It's not that he didn't say those things, he just hadn't spoken at all. So very quickly, it was clear this was a hack. And that then became the pretext used by the...
Clarify a hack, like fake news? Or...
Yeah, it was actually literally hacked into QNA, Qatar News Agency. And the FBI has confirmed this because very immediately the Qataris brought the FBI in as well as the British Secret Service to try and figure out what had happened. How could this happen? And a few weeks later, it was clear it was an externally induced hack. Right? They had put that news in there. And any denials from that very morning, no amount of denials by the Qatari government had any results.
So let me get this straight. So foreign entity hacked into QNA, which is the Qatar news agency.
Yeah.
And hacking in, they got access to post things online.
Exactly.
Right? And under the guise of the Qatari news agency, they posted things that the Emir had said, which he never said.
Exactly.
That nobody heard him say, that he never spoke anywhere, and they just fake news, made it up and put it in there.
And
what was their objective with that?
Well, clearly,
why did they want to create the divide?
To create this image that Qatar was trouble, that the Emir was, particularly the current leadership of Qatar, was trouble for the Gulf and for U.S. interests and everything, and it gave him a peg then to hang the boycott on. This was done in the early hours of the morning, precisely when people are least likely to be awake and aware of what's happening. But no amounts of denials from the Qatari side had any effect on the position and the vitriol that was then instantly being spouted by the media in these boycotting countries. So they had all the experts lined up clearly, immediately, right? As soon as this thing happened, bam, it was a whole series of experts and pundits lined up for the various networks in these 4 countries that explained how bad Qatar was, and this was another proof. And so on the back of that, the boycott was imposed. Now, the longer term...
So let me just interrupt Dr. Nonneman for a second. So the way you're outlining it, this was orchestrated.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Because the embargo happened immediately.
Yes.
Right? Now, an embargo, as you know, and studying international relations, I mean, you can't put that together in a day or a week or a month. I mean, that's a huge effort just to impose the embargo. So that was ready to go.
Yeah.
So they hacked in, they created fake news, and then the embargo just magically appeared at 5 a.m. one day.
It was just, it was
magic.
Yeah. And so it was, and equally magically, you had all these pundits lined up to comment, right? They were all ready. So it was clearly set up. Now, why was it? There are sort of short-term trigger reasons, but there are also longer-term. And the real long-term thing is an irritation a long-standing irritation particularly in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, about Qatar's emergence. Qatar was a backwater. Qatar was very, unambitious. It was the least developed. It was a latecomer. It's very small population, and traditionally that pretty much followed the Saudi lead in regional politics. So, with the emergence since the late 80s and particularly the early 90s of Qatar as a major economic player, and then increasingly adopting an independent line in regional and foreign policy, there's long been irritation, right? There's the sense that, look, Saudi Arabia and then secondarily Abu Dhabi are supposed to be the leading players in the Arabian Peninsula, and suddenly there was this upstart challenging this, or at least not following their line, the groove anymore. Then you get the Sheikh Hamad, the previous Emir, taking power in '95 from his father, as part of the whole reorientation of Qatar in a much more ambitious sense. That was also, for instance, when the gas development was really pushed through, because that was a bit of a gamble at the time. It cost billions of dollars in money that they didn't have. They had to borrow heavily. So
in exploration.
Absolutely, and develop this. To develop an LNG industry is expensive, right? You have to set up long-term relationships, long-distance relationships, and so on. But they did it. So that was part of this.
So they gambled on
They gambled on this, and it worked.
Right.
And so Qatar became, under Sheikh Hamad's leadership, more and more assertive, right?
And that's the emir now.
And no, that was the father of the current emir. So because he handed over power to his son in 2013. So he was in power for about 18 years, 17, 18 years as emir. And as part of this self-assertion, Qatar became far more independent. It wanted to project its independence, didn't want to follow whatever the lead was in Saudi Arabia. So that created further friction, especially because one of the signature developments in Qatari policy was, look, we're not a democracy, but pluralism is not a bad thing. If you hear multiple voices, that's probably better than trying to suppress it all, because it might blow up in your face. So you had Al Jazeera, which, whatever its shortcomings, was the first time there was a network in the Arab world allowing different voices to be heard, sometimes going head-to-head on the screen. There was the first time you had Israeli representatives being broadcast against any of the opposite side. Within Arab politics, you had different voices being given a platform. So that was the first time that was happening. And it changed the media landscape in the Middle East forever. As I say, you can have all kinds of criticism about Al Jazeera, and particularly Al Jazeera Arabic, and people are saying, oh, there is a bit of a predominance of the Muslim Brotherhood voices, and so on. But that, nevertheless, was such a transformation, it didn't go down well in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi. And in general, their sense of what's the right way to govern. In Arabia, it's autocratic stability. That's really it, right? Whereas, and that excludes any potential alternative voices or criticism of aspects of policy and so on. At least that's the situation now, since MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, really took power in Saudi Arabia, and Mohammed bin Zayed consolidated power in Abu Dhabi. Before that, there had been multiple voices around, including in Saudi Arabia. Lots of different princes and others. It was never a democracy, clearly, but there was room for different voices and different ideas about policy to emerge, and then that had to be reconciled. In the UAE, there are 7 emirates. The most important are Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Well, until the financial crisis at the end of where are we? How far do we go back for the financial crisis, the global crisis, which also had an impact in the Gulf?
2008.
Yes. Dubai was vastly over-leveraged, right? So they don't have oil.
Debt.
Yes, exactly. So they would have gone bankrupt's perhaps too heavy a word, but they had to be bailed out by Abu Dhabi. So whereas Dubai...
Because they were dependent on real estate.
Exactly. And they
investments.
Over-leveraged it. So when the market collapsed, then they were left in a hole. And Abu Dhabi had Dubai, the second largest emirate, which had always been one of those alternative voices. Very pragmatic, non-political, wanting to be a hub for trade and services in the whole region, regardless of politics. With Iran, with Qatar, with anybody, right? And they wanted to have this position of being seen as reliably pragmatic in this. That voice has effectively been lost because Dubai has lost that autonomy, because they're effectively in hock to Abu Dhabi for all those billions. And at the same
Abu
time,
Dhabi is, for our audience, because not everybody is the expert that you are. So Abu Dhabi is the leading emirate of the 7 emirates that make up the UAE.
Exactly,
United
and they've
Arab
got
Emirates.
Precisely. They have
And
their
now
own royal
Dubai
family.
is beholden to Abu Dhabi financially because they bailed them out.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the royal family of Dubai...
there's always a cost of money.
Exactly. They haven't quite got that autonomy anymore. And at the same time, the Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince in Abu Dhabi, who's the de facto head of the emirate and the UAE, he got more and more confident, more and more assertive, more and more... So extended the whole security field, intelligence, security, military. That became a federal thing, covering the whole of the emirates. So you get that rising on the one hand, you get Dubai's autonomy diminishing on the other hand. And again, so it's this thing about the alternative voices have gone. So those two rulers, Mohammed bin Salman, de facto controlling Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Zayed, de facto controlling Abu Dhabi and the UAE, have no challengers on their policy decisions anymore. And they certainly...
No alternate voices to reconcile.
Exactly.
So they do what they want.
And
then you have the upstart Qatar, right?
Yeah.
Growing in influence, challenging some of the decisions they make.
Precisely. And so Qatar also saying, well, it's not bad that if people want to follow various forms of political Islam, like the Muslim Brotherhood, as long as they're not jihadist, as long as they're willing to play the political game, and they're not a threat to us, fine. Better engage them, right? Recognize that that's a direction of travel. That's part of the direction of travel of Arab politics. Okay, deal with it. For Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman in Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia, that's not acceptable, because that's potentially a different idea about how people might want to be governed. That's not acceptable. So that's the real friction here. And everything else that you hear about getting closer to Iran or supporting the Muslim Brotherhood or terrorism is just a reflection of that. Then you get the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring meant that all of this became much more acute for these other regimes. So that's really what explains it.
And that's where we got Egypt involved in the embargo.
Exactly.
Believing that Qatar was supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi when he won the election.
Exactly.
So
exactly
that drew the ire of the Egyptian government, the ruling generals, if you will, that are there now.
So, but the interesting thing
is... that's why they came in on the embargo without...
Yeah. And because, again, it's also about autocratic stability. And you brook no challengers. You brook no alternative voices, however peaceful they might be. It's unacceptable. The Qatari government, both internally and regionally, is far more relaxed about that. I say it's not a democracy, but they're not domestically threatened. And their analysis of the direction of travel in Arab politics is just different. Their analysis of the threat that Iran poses is different too. They've always been pragmatic about Iran. There's a lot of talk about, Qatar is getting closer to Iran as an alliance with the Iranians, terrible. It's never going to be an alliance. It's a pragmatic modus vivendi. The Qatari leadership has long decided, like in Oman and like in Kuwait, look, Iran is there. We don't like what they do in a lot of the region. We don't quite trust them necessarily, but they're not going to go anywhere. And we share this major gas field with them. You've got to have a modus vivendi. Moreover, they reckon it's possible to have a modus vivendi with these people. They're not out to change our regimes. So if you can and if you must have a pragmatic relationship, that's what you do. So what's happened is that pragmatic relationship has been strengthened because of the boycott.
Between
Iran and Qatar.
Because of the boycott.
Yeah.
So essentially the boycott or the siege or the embargo, whatever you want to call it, different things, the objective was to get the Qatari government to behave in a certain way, but it's actually backfired because the Qatari government has had no choice now.
Exactly.
But to get closer to Tehran in order to get the goods and get the food and everything else that they need to get around the embargo.
Yeah.
So it actually backfired. So it's not making any sense at all now.
In so many ways. I mean, any idea that you might change the regime or the leadership of the Al Thani government in Qatar.
Was that their objective?
Well, I mean, there's this constant play about putting forward different candidates for rule amongst the Al Thani. They're being shoving forward Sheikh Abdullah bin Ali. They've been Khalid al-Hayl. They've run this conference by the Qatari opposition in London, and there's another one that came up more recently. And they get public airings and write-ups in the media and meetings with the top folks in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, but nobody takes them seriously here. So there must have been some kind of sense that perhaps either they could needle or worry the current regime in Qatar, or maybe even some people believe that there might be room for change.
Right.
Now, there never was, but if anything, the government here is now much more firmly ensconced than it ever was, because there is just a kind of grassroots reaction against the external pressure.
I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that. I know we're running out of time, but this has been fascinating. We're with Dr. Gerd Nonneman. We're here live in Doha, Qatar, at Education City with Dr. Gerd Nonneman, and he's a professor of international relations and Gulf studies at Georgetown University, which is part of the sprawling Education City in Doha, Qatar, and he's also an expert on Middle East politics, specializing in the Gulf economy and Gulf politics. So one of the things that we noticed coming here immediately, Dr. Nonneman, 2 days ago, is the face, a caricature of the face of the current Emir Al Thani on cars, on windows, on storefronts, even in Old City, which we would call Old City. I'm not sure if that's what you would say, but the older part of Doha. Yeah. And the newer part, we saw it on executive buildings, cars, flags, and we were trying to figure out what has spurred this. And so what you were saying is there's a grassroots coming together, if you will, but actually behind the government.
Absolutely right. I mean, this
so
is
it backfired again.
It was a very good example. This whole thing about the portrait of the Emir, Sheikh Tamim, who was still young and was only in power for a very short while before this whole thing happened. That started not as a government initiative. I mean, in lots of these countries around us, you'll be familiar with the portraits of the rulers are plastered everywhere. That was never the case in Qatar. They didn't seem to feel it was necessary. This started as a private initiative by an artist in the souk, and it kind of fired. It went viral.
It was a drawing.
Yeah,
without
this portrait, right?
The headdress.
So, and people started to buy this, and it just went viral. And it even, if you might say, put it that way, infected the expat community. Everybody was going out and getting these posters and stickers and putting up flags and getting hundreds of people would walk up to these things and sign, write all sorts of comments of support.
Even in the hotel that we're staying at, there's a, what do you call it? Mural of the Emir Al Thani, and then I couldn't read them. They were in Arabic, but then all these signatures and little sayings on it.
And so the thing is, this was not orchestrated by the government. People just did it. And in schools and kids and our students get organized and all that kind of thing.
So the siege has brought the country together.
Oh, absolutely. In a way that I didn't think I'd never seen. I mean, I haven't seen the kind of grassroots activity that people taking initiatives. It's almost like a civil society emerging, which has not been, a traditional feature of this region or this country. So that's really interesting. Now, of course, some of the big billboards that you now see is that the government kind of jumped on the bandwagon and the municipality did, right?
But it started as a grassroots effort.
Thing. Absolutely, yeah.
And then we'd go by, we would be wondering, like, you'd go in the parking lot and you'd go by 10 cars and 7 of them would have his sticker on it and 3 wouldn't. You say, well, how come those 3 don't have it on? So, look, I mean...
It's because it's not, nobody tells anyone.
You don't have to do it, right? It's completely voluntary. Yeah. So that's the point I want to make to our audience is it's not like the government said you have to put these stickers on. But people they've spent their own money. They've gone out to buy them. There's one right there that Mike is showing us, and we'll put these up on the website. But I mean, a fascinating coming together of grassroots. And then there was just a conference, I think, yesterday among the Council of Advisors, and they were depicting how just average Qatari citizens had come together in dealing with the embargo, or what they call, I have to get the words right, they call it in your local media the siege.
Yes. Well, I mean, or the boycott,
which does
or
make
whatever.
me laugh. I mean, the boycott, the siege.
But, so it's all part of how it's the language that are being used is not just government organized, right? This is all you get a kind of literally a bottom up feeling, and it's spread through a lot of the expat community too, which is interesting. So that doesn't mean everything's rosy, and because this is still the impact, the economic impact, and the humanitarian impact. That's been the worst. I think it's been. If I look at what the people I know say, if I look at our students, the Qatari students, it's been traumatic. Not because of the economic impacts, because that's all been controlled now. Economically, Qatar's fine.
They figured it out.
The real dollar peg is fine. There's no pressure from the markets. The major outflows of money from the central bank and so on, that's all stopped. So it's fine. I mean, of course, it's not completely comfortable. You'd prefer it not to be in place, but okay, so they can deal with it if the alternative is to be seen to give up sovereignty.
Right.
But it's the humanitarian side, it's the social side. People have grown up, 2 generations have grown up with the existence of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which gave formal shape to what had been a long-standing network, social and kinship network across the Gulf. People had families, married across borders, traveled, and so on and so on. What had happened in the last 2 generations with the GCC is that they now were able to invest without any problems, travel without passports.
Right. So you could get married and one spouse is from UAE, one is from Qatar. Yeah. And you could buy property in both, travel between the two, so no problem.
The last two generations, that's it. They've grown up like this,
Right.
So the idea
of
the Gulf identity had become even stronger than it already had been. And suddenly that's severed.
In half.
And that, I think people here, the Qatari population, were just shocked beyond belief. They knew, and the leadership knew there could be trouble, there could be friction that had to be managed, and so on and so on and so on. Ambassadors might be withdrawn, but traditionally there had always been ways of keeping open avenues for face saving, for conflict resolution, for managing it in the end, and
within
so on,
the Gulf
right?
states.
Yeah, and it's suddenly. All of that suddenly blown up. And I think that's been very traumatic for the local population. And that's undercut any sort of trust. I mean, there is no ill feeling towards the other populations of the Gulf states. There's not even, I think, ill feeling or blame directed at the sort of wholesale ruling families or ruling elites in the other countries. It's, I think, concentrated on the particular individuals that is seen as being responsible. So King Salman of Saudi Arabia, for instance, is still respected among Qatari population. They don't think he's really ultimately responsible for this.
Who do they blame?
Oh, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. But as a result, that the confidence, whether at a popular level or at a government level, in those wielders of power is gone. It's going to be very difficult to restore this. Even if the conflict is ameliorated and contained, the longer term effect is going to stay. The GCC is never going to recover from this. Supply networks, reliance on Dubai as it used to be, that's never going to return.
Right.
They're going to be far more self-sufficient and reliant on these alternative networks that they've now established.
So they're actually, for the Qatari government, there's a silver lining to all this because they've become more independent. They found their own way through it. The people have come together.
Lining.
Huh?
Gold lining.
Yes. Gold lining, if you will. So, Dr. Nonneman, we're almost out of time. A couple more questions. So, the 13 demands that the embargoing 3 countries have put forth from talking to Qatar government officials, there's no resolution. They're not going to agree to those 13 terms.
They're never going to agree to the 13 as stated. And in fact, I don't think they were ever meant to be a basis for an agreement. I don't think these 13 conditions were put out there to be agreed to. I mean, it was almost as if they were put up there.
Propaganda.
Yeah, and to say either if you accept this, then you give, then you, that's it. You're completely submitted, and everybody knows you're no longer an independent country. But that wasn't really the aim to get them to admit these. There are a number of issues that are long running that are basis for concern. But is it possible to think of a rational face-saving deal, a package that would, under normal circumstances, allow people to get rid of the worst aspects of this boycott? Yes, because it's not good for Dubai particularly. It's ultimately not great for Saudi Arabia's image. Because Saudi Arabia at the moment needs international investor confidence. That means reliance on predictable policies, rational decision making. This is not a great example of it. But it all depends on the decision makers in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. But so yes, a deal is completely conceivable. It would include things like things that Qataris have already been doing. They've clearly been closing down loopholes in funding to undesirable elements around the Middle East, to jihadist groups. They've really clamped down new legislation. They're bringing in the Treasury folk to embed them inside the Qatari system, financial systems, to control these things. They've cut off certain recipients of their funding. They've put conditions on others, or else they'll be cut off, and so on and so on. So they've been very active already, as has been recognized by the State Department and others in the US. They're the first of the Gulf countries to do a deal for counterterrorism collaboration with the US and actually follow up on it. Mm-hmm. There has been discussion internally for some time about a possible bias of Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers in Al Jazeera Arabic. That's never defined Al Jazeera Arabic. It's much wider than that. But there's been a recognition that for some people this has been perhaps needed adjusting. If anything, the boycott has stopped that, or at least delayed a reaction to that. On Iran, well, I mean, I'd say that's not an alliance, that's a pragmatic arrangement, but they're not going to cut off that relationship. On the Muslim Brotherhood, similarly, their assessment is, look, this is not a terrorist organization. They've been willing to play the political game, not just in Egypt, but in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Yemen, where they might be called different names. They're not really a threat. So why should we declare them a terrorist organization if they're not? And of course, they can point to much of the rest of the world where similarly they're not designated as a terrorist organization. So there are certain areas where they are already moving, and that could all be put together as a package and presented as, look, we've got something that can be guaranteed by the US. But there are certain things where they're not going to compromise, because in their assessment, it would go against what they think the reality of what the facts are, and rolling over on those issues like closing Al Jazeera, they will never do.
Why would they do that?
Exactly.
I mean, why would you shut down an
Absolutely
independent media
Precisely.
network and control various voices and curtail free speech? I mean, why would you do that?
Exactly.
Plus, they've invested billions and billions of dollars in it.
Exactly right.
Plus, it's a good network.
Yeah. I mean,
So it doesn't make any sense.
that's right. So that's what I said. I think there will be a willingness, as long as it's not seen as being done under duress, to nudge
Compromise.
the Al Jazeera Arabic side into a relatively less, let's say, lesser presence of Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers.
More balance.
Yes, but that's the sort of thing that.
So that might be a compromise that they could easily.
And
easily
they were interested in moving in that direction already before the boycott.
So it would be easy for them to do.
Yeah.
Final thing, because I know we're really pressed here on time. And by the way, we're with Dr. Gerd Nonneman. He is the professor of international relations and Gulf studies at Georgetown University, which is part of the Education City in Doha, where we are today, live in Doha, Qatar. And he's also an expert on Middle East politics, as you've heard, and specializing in the Gulf economy and Gulf politics. So, Dr. Nonneman, final thing, the Saudi government has a big presence this week in Washington, D.C., as you know. Mm-hmm. The Crown Prince there, and he's going to be touring the USA, get some positive media out of it. U.S. media so far has not been particularly friendly to the Qatari cause. So far, in general, aggregate, because they don't. It's a tough issue to understand. It's easy to take the Saudi position on it. But my question is, President Trump yesterday, so the timing for our meeting here is fabulous, said he was very concerned about the strife within the GCC. And he said, look, I gave the GCC 9 months to figure this out amongst themselves. They should have been able to do that. They can't. Now, perhaps the U.S. needs to step in as a mediator to get this dispute resolved for the betterment of all the people of the Gulf. What impact do you think the U.S. can have, and should they even be involved in it, in the mediation?
It's crystal ball gazing. I mean, to be honest, I don't hold out much hope. there is some hope, because the only external actor that can have an impact is the US. Because all of these states fundamentally depend and will continue to depend on the US, not just economically, but for their security. There's a lot of talk about the US withdrawing and about the rest of the world stepping up, and Russia and China and so on. There is a tiny bit of truth to that, but really, ultimately, there's nobody that can replace US power projection capability, and that's not that's not an illusion that the local holders of power have, right? So they all want to continue to anchor their security in US protection in that relationship, even if they build complementary relationships elsewhere. So that means the US has leverage, particularly because for the US, from the US perspective, the Gulf, the GCC, is actually, whatever its failings, was a useful platform to build collaborative security arrangements. Think about missile defense. Missile defense cannot be effective in this region if all these countries do their own little thing, right? And that's so it's kind of obvious. That's why it's in the interest. That's why the Pentagon people like Jim Mattis and the State Department and others now realize this is in the interests of the US too. So there's an interest, there is leverage of sorts. The question is how far the US would want to push people like Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed. Because for Mohammed bin Salman, he is so adamantly anti-Muslim Brotherhood now, and anti-Iran, of course, as well, that I can't really see what would drive him to budge, unless it is this whole big reformist project, the economic reform project in Saudi Arabia.
Isn't that Saudi 2030 or something?
Yeah, so he needs to.
Is that what it is? Saudi
exactly
2030?
The 2030 plan, the vision, Vision 2030. He needs
Vision
to.
2030.
He needs to create jobs, because there are millions of jobs that need to be created in the next few years, and the revenue, even though oil prices are a bit higher now, the revenue is not on a sustainable path. They're consuming far too much of their own energy resources at home. And they need to win the economy of oil and create jobs. For that, they need huge investment, international investment. That means they need the international investors' confidence in long-term predictability, in not untroubled waters. Things like the Qatar crisis are not positive for that. So maybe that's one little peg that can be used, or a lever that can be used. But I don't hold out great hopes.
So in a perfect world, we have GCC Trump summit in Camp David with all the GCC countries, and somehow they get a save-face compromise worked out so that the siege can be lifted. I like calling it the siege because it's in the local media and it's a good word to use.
Yeah.
But you call it the embargo. Or
the boycott. Or whatever.
Yes, the boycott. Final comment I want to make is, because we are at a time and you've been so gracious, is I'm enthralled and fascinated here in Qatar with the freedom of the media. It's really incredible. The newspapers, I get up early, read 2 a day, which is the Gulf Times, and then
the Peninsula, maybe,
and then Qatar Today.
Yes,
right,
yeah,
another local paper.
Yeah.
But I mean, the coverage of just straight news.
Yeah.
I come right now in the U.S. There's so much bias and so much opinion journalism.
Yeah.
You pick these papers up, and it's just straight news of the day.
Yeah.
Right? There's opinion is on one page.
Yeah.
So it's pretty fascinating. We got to take off, but I can't thank you enough for the time.
It's a pleasure.
And your insight. But we have had a fascinating discussion here today in Georgetown University, in Education City in Doha, Qatar, with Dr. Gerd Nonneman. He is a professor of International and Gulf Studies at Georgetown University, part of the Education City here. 8 other U.S. and international colleges make it up, and he's also, as you've heard, a tremendous expert on Middle East politics, specializing in the Gulf economy and the Gulf political situation. This has been a fascinating time that we've had together, Professor.
Big shukran.
Yes, indeed.
Big shukran.
Shukran to you. Thank you very much.
Big shukran to Gerd Nonneman. And we will be
interesting.
in touch, and thank you so much. And let's see if that Trump Camp David GCC summit actually becomes a reality.
We can only hope.
Thank you, sir.